Marcus Hill had spent his whole life being told he wasn't enough. In classrooms, in interviews, in every space where skin still spoke louder than skill, doors slammed in his face. But that day, in a crowded lecture hall, a white professor set him up to fail with an impossible problem. The room laughed, waiting for Marcus to crumble, until his first stroke of chalk silenced everyone. What happened next, no one saw coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The lecture hall was an ocean of polished wooden seats, rising in perfect symmetry like watchful eyes. The air hummed with a low current of anticipation, though no one dared to say why. Students whispered among themselves, their voices little more than shadows. A guest lecturer had been announced for the day, and the curiosity that came with any break from routine electrified the atmosphere. At the front, Dr. Stephen Caldwell stood with his hands clasped behind his back, surveying the crowd with a cold satisfaction. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with neatly combed silver hair and a sharpness in his gaze that could slice through a student before they even spoke. His reputation was legendary across the university, brilliant, unflinching, and cruel. Students described him as the kind of professor who didn't just test your knowledge, but tested your pride, and most walked away broken. It wasn't only students who carried those scars. Younger faculty members often avoided crossing him, quietly bending under his influence. Caldwell wore his arrogance like an expensive suit, tailored and precise, reminding everyone of his untouchable status within the mathematics department. But this morning his sense of order was interrupted. The door to the lecture hall creaked open, and in walked Marcus Hill. Marcus was a man in his late 30s, tall and lean, with skin the color of polished mahogany and a quiet confidence that traveled with him like a shadow. He carried a leather satchel, worn but cared for, filled with neatly arranged notes and books. His presence was different, not loud, not imposing, but steady, like a drumbeat under the noise of a crowd. Students shifted uncomfortably. Many had read the email, guest lecture, the overlap of history and numbers. Some were intrigued, others skeptical. Why was a history teacher stepping into a math professor's domain? And more importantly, why had Caldwell allowed it? The truth was, Caldwell hadn't allowed it. The invitation had come from the dean, who believed in cross-disciplinary collaboration, an initiative Caldwell despised. To him, disciplines were territories, and Marcus had trespassed. Worse still, Marcus was black, a detail Caldwell rarely acknowledged out loud, but carried in his smirks, in his dismissive tone, in the way his eyes seemed to narrow as though Marcus's very presence was an affront. Marcus walked slowly toward the podium, placing his satchel on the table. He greeted the class with a nod, his voice calm when he finally spoke. Good morning, everyone. Today we'll explore how numbers have not only shaped economies and societies, but also dictated the narratives we carry into the present. History and mathematics are not opposites. They are intertwined. Some students perked up, others exchanged glances. Caldwell's jaw tightened. To him this was nonsense, fluff dressed in academic language. He shifted his stance, crossing one leg over the other, ready to pounce on the first stumble. Marcus continued, his voice unwavering. For example, we often look at census records as pure data, but behind those numbers are human lives, decisions about who was counted and who was erased. When we analyze numbers without context, we risk accepting lies as truth. It was clear Marcus had done this before. His words painted pictures, his cadence drawing students in like a story unfolding. He didn't need to be flashy. He was deliberate, careful, building a foundation. But Caldwell wasn't listening for meaning. He was listening for weakness. He leaned toward the front row, muttering loudly enough for the room to hear. A history teacher lecturing on math. What's next? A painter teaching engineering. The room chuckled nervously. Marcus paused, his eyes flicking briefly toward Caldwell. But he didn't take the bait. He turned back to the board and began sketching a timeline that blended historical events with the rise of mathematical principles. Caldwell's smirk widened. He knew this game. He had broken stronger men than Marcus by pushing them off balance, making them feel like outsiders in their own work. And to him, Marcus was an outsider in every sense. The weight of Caldwell's disdain hung heavy in the room. Students shifted in their seats, unsure whether to side with the authority they feared or the guest lecturer they didn't yet know. The silence was suffocating, not neutral but charged, judgment bleeding into every glance. Marcus, however, didn't falter. He carried on with measured precision, referencing the use of logarithms in navigation, and the way calculations determined trade routes that shaped entire civilizations. His voice carried a subtle conviction. History was not just stories, and math was not just numbers. They were threads of the same tapestry. But Caldwell was growing restless. He wasn't used to his interruptions being ignored. His chest tightened with irritation, and his pride itched to reclaim control of the room. He took a step forward, his shoes echoing sharply on the tile floor. The noise sliced through Marcus's explanation, pulling every pair of eyes back to the professor. "Mr. Hill," Caldwell said, drawing out the name with deliberate condescension. "If you insist on bringing history into mathematics, perhaps you'd like to show us how well you handle mathematics itself." The words dripped with venom, masked under a polite smile. Marcus turned to face him fully now. There was no fear in his eyes, only the steady calm of a man who had been underestimated too many times to count. "I came here to lecture on my subject, Dr. Caldwell," he replied evenly. Caldwell's smile widened. Predatory. "Oh, but what better way to demonstrate your point than to prove yourself mathematically?" The students stiffened, sensing the shift. They knew that tone. Caldwell wasn't just asking a question, he was preparing to humiliate. His challenges were notorious, often designed to showcase his brilliance at another's expense. Marcus hesitated for the first time, not because he doubted himself, but because he understood the trap. This wasn't about numbers, it was about status, about race, about who was allowed to stand in front of this room with authority. The silence grew unbearable. A cough echoed from the back row. Pens clicked nervously. Caldwell seized the moment. He straightened his tie and announced, "In fact, let's make it interesting. A surprise test." Gasps rippled through the room. Surprise tests were Caldwell's signature weapon, feared and despised. But never before had he aimed one at a fellow educator. His eyes locked on Marcus, daring him to object, daring him to walk away. Marcus, still standing with his notes unopened on the podium, slowly placed his hands on the edge of the table. His chest rose and fell in a controlled breath. This wasn't just about him. He knew that. Every student watching carried their own silent history of dismissal, of being underestimated. His decision now would ripple beyond this moment. He looked at Caldwell, calm and unshaken, as if weighing the challenge not with fear but with something deeper, a quiet defiance. Just as Marcus opened his notes, Caldwell stood tall, his voice booming through the auditorium. "Class, put everything away. Today we test the history teacher." The silence that followed Caldwell's announcement was deafening. Dozens of pens snapped shut, notebooks slid back into backpacks, and laptops clicked closed. The weight of his authority pressed down on the room like a storm cloud. Students exchanged wary glances, some smirking, others uncomfortable, but none daring to intervene. Marcus remained at the podium, his hand hovering over his notes. He didn't look shaken, but inside memories stirred, memories that had shaped the man standing here today. For while everyone else in this auditorium saw only a history teacher caught off guard, Marcus carried with him a lifetime of scars, carved by similar moments, moments designed to make him feel less than what he truly was. To understand Marcus Hill was to trace the long, uneven road he had traveled, one paved not with opportunity but with obstacles. He grew up in a modest neighborhood in Baltimore, in a two-bedroom apartment shared with his mother and younger sister. His father had left early, leaving Marcus's mother, Diane Hill, to work double shifts at the hospital just to keep food on the table. Marcus was a curious child, often burying himself in books his mother scavenged from second-hand shops. By middle school, he was obsessed with two things: history and mathematics. Numbers fascinated him, not just for their precision, but for their rhythm. He could see patterns where others saw confusion, connections hidden in the chaos. But talent in a black boy was often mistaken for arrogance. At 12, Marcus's math teacher accused him of cheating when he solved equations faster than his peers. "There's no way you figured that out on your own," the teacher said coldly, confiscating his paper. The sting of that accusation never left him. Not the words themselves, but the quiet acceptance from the other students, the way no one questioned it. By high school, the pattern had repeated itself. Teachers praised his writing, but dismissed his mathematical ability as lucky guesses. When he applied for an advanced math program, his application was lost. When he challenged the decision, the counselor told him bluntly, "Maybe focus on something more realistic." Realistic. The word echoed in his mind for years. Yet Marcus refused to let bitterness consume him. He excelled in history, channeling his frustration into understanding the patterns of power and oppression that had shaped lives like his own. But secretly, he kept working on math problems late at night, scribbling equations in worn notebooks, solving puzzles meant for students in programs he was never allowed to enter. At 17, he entered a statewide math competition under the sponsorship of a local community mentor. Against all odds, he won second place. But instead of celebration, he faced skepticism. The judges whispered about discrepancies in his work, demanding he re-explain his solutions on the spot. Marcus did, flawlessly, yet the trophy handed to him felt hollow, weighed down by the doubt that trailed his every success. Scholarships came for history, not for mathematics. He took what he could, attending college on partial aid, studying historical narratives that resonated with his own lived reality. But even then, math lingered in the background, a secret strength he kept hidden. Now years later, as he stood in this lecture hall under Caldwell's gaze, those same scars threatened to reopen. The professor's challenge wasn't just about numbers, it was about legitimacy, about who was allowed to stand at the front of this room. Caldwell, for his part, savored the silence. He turned to the board, his chalk tapping rhythmically as he began writing a problem. His movements were deliberate, dramatic, each line of the equation sprawling across the white surface like a warning. Students leaned forward, murmuring as the complexity unfolded. This wasn't a textbook example, it was an intricate calculus problem. Layers of integration and substitution designed to trip up even advanced students. Caldwell's smirk deepened as he stepped aside, gesturing to Marcus with a sweep of his hand. "Mr. Hill," he said, the words dipped in condescension, "since you believe history and mathematics walk hand in hand, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate." Marcus's eyes flicked to the board. For a moment he simply studied the problem. His expression didn't change, but inside, the storm brewed. This wasn't new. He had seen this tactic before. Men like Caldwell who believed that authority could mask their insecurity, who used humiliation as a weapon. He remembered his first year teaching high school. A parent had questioned his qualifications in front of the principal, insisting that a man like him couldn't possibly prepare students for college. He remembered being pulled over 3 times in 1 month, while driving to his night classes, each stop ending with a search and a warning, as though his very existence behind the wheel of a decent car was a crime. He remembered sitting through faculty meetings where colleagues talked over him, their eyes never meeting his suggestions left hanging in the air as though he weren't even present. And yet, through it all, Marcus endured. He endured not because he accepted their judgments, but because he knew his worth, even when the world pretended not to see it. Now, the auditorium's gaze was fixed entirely on him. Students expected entertainment, either the spectacle of Caldwell's triumph or the rare possibility of his defeat. Marcus stepped forward slowly, each footfall echoing against the floor. He didn't rush, his calmness unsettled. Caldwell, who expected flustered denial or stammering refusal. Instead, Marcus placed his notes gently back into his satchel, closing it with finality, as though declaring that this moment required no script. "Very well," Marcus said evenly, his baritone steady. The students listened, rapt. It wasn't the kind of speech they were used to hearing in a math lecture, but it carried a weight that no equation could diminish. Marcus turned back to the board, raising the chalk again, and that's when Caldwell struck the final blow of the challenge. "Then let's test that perception, shall we?" Caldwell said loudly, his voice booming through the auditorium. He walked toward the board, and with a smug flourish, underlined the equation. "This problem," he declared, "has stumped even my graduate students. If you can solve it, perhaps you've earned the right to stand here. If not," he paused, letting the silence stretch, "well then history will remain your only refuge." The jab landed, sharp and cruel. Students gasped, some laughing nervously, others shifting in discomfort. The problem scrawled across the board was no ordinary calculus exercise. It sprawled like a labyrinth, an integration tangled with nested functions and deceptive substitutions. To the untrained eye, it looked like an indecipherable storm of symbols. To any advanced student, it was recognizable, the kind of problem you saved for competitions or doctoral qualifiers, not a public spectacle in a lecture hall. But Caldwell hadn't chosen this at random. No, he had carefully selected it. It was a weapon dressed as an equation, designed not to test knowledge, but to humiliate. He wanted Marcus to falter in front of everyone, to erase whatever dignity the man carried into this room. and the students knew it. A nervous ripple spread through the rows. Some whispered to each other, trying to make sense of the puzzle, their voices laced with smug amusement. A few even laughed quietly, shaking their heads. "History man's about to drown," one boy muttered, drawing a stifled chuckle from his friend. The cruelty wasn't in Caldwell's words alone. It was in the silence of complicity, the unspoken expectation that Marcus would fail because he didn't belong here. Marcus could feel it all. The weight of the smirks, the smothering quiet, the invisible hand of prejudice pressing down on him. But he had felt this before, in classrooms, in offices, in everyday moments where his worth was questioned, simply because of who he was. This was not new territory. This was just another battlefield, where the weapons were words and expectations instead of fists. He stepped closer to the board, his eyes scanning the problem. He didn't panic, though the trap was obvious. Caldwell had layered it with misleading pathways, subtle manipulations that would lead an unsteady solver into circles, until they collapsed in frustration. "You see, class," he began, as though this were a lesson for them rather than a trap for Marcus. "Mathematics doesn't bend to sentiment. It doesn't care about stories or narratives. Either you solve it, or you don't. And those who don't, well, perhaps they should stay in their lane." The jab was obvious. Students exchanged uneasy looks, some nodding in agreement, others shrinking in discomfort. The auditorium had become a stage, and Marcus stood in the center, the spotlight harsh and unforgiving. For a brief moment, Marcus's chest tightened. He remembered the words from his youth, the endless repetition, "You don't belong. Stay in your place." Every memory flickered like old film reels. The teacher who accused him of cheating, the scholarship committee who told him he wasn't the right fit, the dean who once suggested he focus on cultural studies instead of pursuing math electives. But Marcus also remembered something else. The nights he stayed up solving equations in the quiet, the satisfaction of seeing patterns unfold where others saw chaos, the secret joy of knowing he could navigate a puzzle meant to break him. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. "Numbers don't care about stories," Marcus repeated, his tone even, his eyes still fixed on the board. "Perhaps, but stories care about numbers. And without numbers, history doesn't exist." The words were not for Caldwell. They were for the room, for the students watching with conflicted eyes. Some of them leaned forward now, curiosity replacing smugness. Caldwell's smirk faltered briefly, then reformed sharper. "Then prove it, Mr. Hill." Marcus reached for the chalk, but instead of immediately writing, he turned to the students. His voice carried, calm but charged with quiet authority. "You're all watching to see whether I fail," he said plainly. "But you should be asking why this problem was chosen. Why this one? Why now? Why me? Sometimes the challenge isn't about the equation itself, it's about who is expected to fall under its weight." The room froze. Students weren't used to someone addressing the unspoken so directly, especially in Caldwell's presence. The professor's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, unwilling to break the illusion of control. Marcus turned back to the board, the chalk cool and dry between his fingers. He raised his hand, steady, deliberate, and for the first time, he touched the symbols. His strokes were slow, measured, as he began to break the problem into its first layer. The auditorium leaned in collectively. The hush was suffocating. Every sound magnified. The scratch of chalk, the squeak of a chair, the faint hum of the overhead lights. Caldwell tried to cut through the silence with a chuckle. "Don't worry, class. He'll last a step or two." But Marcus didn't flinch. He mapped out the foundation, outlining the substitutions instead of diving blindly into the mess. He didn't rush, didn't stumble. Every line was intentional, revealing a method hidden beneath the chaos. And then something shifted. A student in the back row, a sophomore named Eric, tilted his head. He recognized the approach, not the obvious path, but a clever detour he'd seen only once in an advanced seminar. His eyes widened. "Wait, he's not lost. He knows what he's doing." Eric glanced at the girl beside him. "He's actually solving it." The words rippled forward like a spark catching dry leaves. Students leaned closer, whispering in disbelief. Caldwell heard the shift. His smirk tightened into a hard line. He hadn't expected Marcus to make it this far, to approach the problem with such precision. His plan was unraveling, and for the first time, the authority in his posture cracked. But Marcus wasn't solving this for Caldwell. He wasn't even solving it for the students. He was solving it for every younger version of himself who had been told he didn't belong. for every quiet kid who had swallowed their brilliance to survive. Each stroke of chalk was more than math. It was defiance carved in white dust. Caldwell stepped forward, his voice sharper now. "Careful there, Mr. Hill. One wrong step and the whole solution collapses." Marcus didn't turn. His hand moved smoothly, laying down another step that drew audible gasps. He had dismantled the first trap. A girl in the front row whispered, almost in awe, "He's not supposed to be able to do this." Marcus's hand paused briefly. Not from doubt, but from a memory. He thought of the night his mother had fallen asleep at the kitchen table after her second shift, whispering to him before drifting off, "Don't let them tell you who you are. You already know." He breathed deeply, grounding himself in her words. The board began to fill, line by line, with his careful method. The problem was untangling itself, slowly revealing its structure under Marcus's hand. And yet, in that very moment of progress, another unexpected twist cut through the tension. From the third row, a student muttered loudly enough for many to hear. Probably memorized it. Someone must have fed him the answer. Laughter bubbled from a few corners of the room. The accusation hit with the same sting Marcus had felt since boyhood. "You can't be this smart. You must have cheated." Marcus froze for just a heartbeat, the chalk still pressed against the board. He didn't turn, didn't lash out. Instead, he straightened his back, lifted the chalk again, and resumed with even greater precision. The laughter died, as quickly as it started, swallowed by the realization that he wasn't faltering. He was climbing. The board was nearly halfway solved now, and the room no longer smirked. They watched in silence, their doubt cracking, replaced with reluctant awe. Caldwell's jaw clenched. His trap was failing, and yet he clung to hope. The hardest step still lay ahead. Surely Marcus would trip eventually. Surely the history teacher couldn't finish what even graduate students had left undone. But Marcus's hand did not tremble. His movements were deliberate, steady, as though the years of doubt had forged an unshakable rhythm. Every breath in the auditorium seemed to sync with the scratch of chalk against the board. Students leaned forward, eyes wide, waiting, searching for the inevitable collapse that still hadn't come. And then it happened. The moment no one expected. Marcus set down the chalk, only for a moment, and looked directly at Caldwell. His eyes carried no malice, no desperation, only quiet strength. "I don't panic when the problem is meant to break me," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the silence, "because I've been solving problems like this my whole life." The words landed heavier than any calculation, striking the room into a deeper hush. And then, without hesitation, Marcus reached again for the chalk. Instead of panicking, Marcus slowly picked up the chalk, his steady hands defying the professor's expectations. The chalk dragged against the board, releasing a faint squeak that echoed through the silence. Marcus's handwriting was deliberate, every stroke angled with care, as though he were sketching a map instead of solving an equation. The auditorium leaned forward, hundreds of eyes locked on his steady hand. Murmurs began almost instantly. "He's starting wrong." "No, that's not the substitution Caldwell wanted." "History guy's just stalling." Caldwell heard the whispers, and his smirk deepened. He crossed his arms and leaned back against the desk at the front of the room, tilting his head like a judge, waiting for the guilty to incriminate themselves. His posture screamed confidence, his silence louder than words. "Watch, he's about to crumble." Marcus didn't acknowledge the noise. He'd lived through whispers his entire life. In classrooms, on sidewalks, in meetings where his ideas were ignored, until repeated by someone else. Whispers had followed him like shadows, carrying the same message in different forms. "You don't belong here." But this time he let the whispers fuel him. Each murmur was a challenge, each doubt a reminder of why he could not, would not stop. His first line of chalk was unorthodox. Instead of diving into the tangle of integrals, he drew an outline of substitution variables along the margin, setting up a framework. It wasn't the conventional way, it was his way, methodical, strategic, designed to expose the skeleton of the problem before cutting into its flesh. Students squinted. Some whispered louder. "What's he doing? That's not how we learned it. He's wasting time. He's gonna embarrass himself." Caldwell's eyes gleamed. "See that?" he said to no one in particular, but loud enough for the first row to hear. "Classic mistake. You don't solve an integration problem like that. He's overcomplicating it. Textbook error." A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the room. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but his hand didn't falter. He added another line, connecting his substitutions, simplifying small pieces at the edges instead of attacking the center head-on. The problem was vast, intimidating, and Caldwell had designed it that way. But Marcus knew from life itself that overwhelming problems were never solved by charging blindly into the middle. They were dismantled piece by piece. And then in the very back row, something shifted. A young woman, slender with dark curls spilling down her shoulders, leaned forward. Her name was Maya Williams, a second-year engineering student who had always kept to herself in class. She wasn't one of Caldwell's favorites. He often ignored her when she raised her hand, sometimes pretending he hadn't even seen it. But she was sharp, observant, and far more advanced than Caldwell ever bothered to notice. As Marcus worked through the first substitution, Maya's eyes widened. She recognized the structure. It wasn't guesswork. It wasn't luck. It was a method, rare, elegant, one she had only glimpsed once in a research paper, tucked away in an obscure journal. Her lips parted in shock. "He's not stalling," she whispered under her breath. He's building a shortcut." The student beside her, a tall boy slouched lazily in his seat, turned with a smirk. "Shortcut? Please. He's lost. Just wait." But Maya's heart was racing. She couldn't look away from the board. Each step Marcus took revealed another layer of structure, a clarity invisible to those still waiting for him to fail. Meanwhile, the murmurs grew heavier, filling the air like smoke. "Why is he writing in the margin? This is embarrassing. Caldwell's gonna destroy him." Caldwell, emboldened by the room's skepticism, took a step forward. His voice was dripping with disdain. "Mr. Hill, if you're trying to improvise your way out of this, let me remind you, mathematics is about precision, not theatrics." Marcus paused briefly, the chalk frozen in his hand. Slowly he turned his head toward Caldwell, his eyes calm, his voice steady. "Sometimes precision requires a different perspective." The words were simple, but the quiet conviction behind them drew another hush across the room. Marcus turned back to the board and continued, connecting the substitutions. What looked like scribbles to most now began to take shape, a framework tightening into something logical, something undeniable. Caldwell's smirk flickered. By the third line, Maya's pulse was pounding. Her eyes darted to the others around her, desperate for someone else to see what she saw. "Don't you get it?" she whispered fiercely to the boy beside her. "He's not just attempting it, he's solving it."
The boy scoffed. "Yeah, right."
But even he leaned forward now, doubt creeping into his smirk. Caldwell's arms uncrossed. He shifted uneasily, stepping closer to the board. Marcus's method wasn't collapsing. It was holding. Stronger than expected. The whispers in the auditorium began to change. "Wait, did that actually simplify? Hold on, is he? That step looked right." Marcus heard them. He didn't respond. He stayed focused, his movements steady, each new line adding weight to the realization dawning across the room. For the first time, it wasn't just Caldwell who doubted. It was the students. But not in the way they had before. They weren't doubting Marcus's failure. They were doubting their own expectations of him. And that shift was dangerous. Caldwell's authority had always rested on certainty. Certainty that he was the expert. Certainty that those he mocked would crumble. Certainty that everyone else would silently agree. But certainty was slipping, inch by inch with every stroke of Marcus's chalk. Marcus's chest rose and fell with calm determination. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't performing. He was simply doing the work, piece by piece, the way he had always approached every challenge life threw at him. The auditorium was no longer laughing. The chuckles had died. The only sound was the faint scratch of chalk and the quickened breaths of those realizing what was happening. Marcus, the history man, the outsider, wasn't fumbling through. He was cutting through a problem Caldwell had designed to humiliate. And in the very back row, Maya's gasp finally broke the silence. Her eyes widened as the truth slammed into her. Marcus wasn't just attempting the problem, he was solving it. The gasp from the back row lingered in the air like a note struck too sharply on a piano, pulling eyes away from Marcus and toward the girl who had made it. But Marcus didn't turn. His hand kept moving, chalk against board, as if the sound hadn't reached him. Caldwell, however, had heard it clearly. His jaw twitched. His smirk, though still plastered on his face, was no longer effortless. For a split second, a glimmer of unease flickered in his eyes. He forced it away with a low chuckle, straightening his back, reclaiming the posture of a man in control. He walked forward, shoes clacking against the tile, stopping just a few feet behind Marcus. His voice carried the polished tone of a professor masking cruelty under the guise of instruction. Careful there, Mr. Hill. Your substitutions look creative. But you do realize that's not the conventional method, yes. Marcus paused only long enough to acknowledge him with a glance over his shoulder. His expression was calm, neither defensive nor rattled. I'm aware. Caldwell smiled, a wide, false smile, the kind used in photographs taken with people you despise. Awareness is one thing. Accuracy, however, is another. The class laughed softly, the nervous kind of laughter people use when they aren't sure whether to resist or conform. Caldwell knew that laugh. He thrived on it. It was the sound of power holding court, the sound of witnesses choosing silence rather than risk. Marcus turned back to the board and wrote another step. The simplification flowed seamlessly, eliminating one of the intentional traps Caldwell had built into the problem. The professor's smile tightened. Interesting, Caldwell said, stepping closer. But of course, a man without formal mathematical credentials may not realize that this. He jabbed a finger toward one of Marcus's substitutions, nearly brushing his hand, isn't exactly proper notation. In this department, we value precision. The students chuckled again. A few nodded, but others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It wasn't hard to see what was happening. Caldwell wasn't simply critiquing. He was undermining. Marcus placed the chalk back on the board with deliberate calm. He spoke softly, but his voice carried through the auditorium. Notation is a language. Meaning matters more than form. The math stands whether or not the symbols please your eye. The words landed like a quiet strike. Students who had once smirked now leaned forward, intrigued. The room, once solidly in Caldwell's grasp, was beginning to tilt. Caldwell's smile sharpened, baring teeth. Spoken like someone who's never had to defend his work in a peer-reviewed journal. Another ripple of laughter. This one heavier, crueler, emboldened by the professor's sneer. Marcus's hand froze, not in fear, but in remembrance. He had heard versions of that line his entire life. You don't belong here. You're not one of us. In school, in job interviews, even at community board meetings where his expertise was casually dismissed until repeated by someone else. He set down the chalk for a moment, turning fully to face Caldwell. His eyes were steady, his voice low but cutting, or spoken like someone who's had to defend his work in life itself. Every single day. The laughter faltered. The silence that followed was heavier than before, uncomfortable but undeniable. Caldwell blinked, just once, before masking the flicker of anger with another smile. Touching. But sentiment won't solve an integral. He gestured toward the board, reclaiming his role as the arbiter. Marcus turned back. He picked up the chalk again. His strokes were calm, steady, even as his mind burned with every slight, every unnecessary correction. Every reminder that no matter how right he was, men like Caldwell would always look for ways to make him seem wrong. And yet the interruptions didn't derail him. They sharpened him. Each dismissal fueled his concentration, as though the insults were stones sharpening the blade of his resolve. Step by step, the impossible problem began to bend. The murmurs in the hall shifted again. Students were no longer laughing. Some were leaning forward, scribbling notes, trying to follow Marcus's method. Others looked at Caldwell with subtle unease, realizing the professor's so-called corrections were hollow. Then came the twist. From the second row, a hand shot up. It was Rachel Thompson, a junior in engineering, who rarely spoke in Caldwell's lectures after he had once brushed off her question as irrelevant. She cleared her throat nervously, but didn't lower her hand. Yes? Caldwell said, his voice dripping with irritation. Rachel hesitated, then spoke. He's right. His substitutions work. That step there. She pointed to the board. It's not conventional, but it's valid. It simplifies faster than the method you usually teach. The room shifted again. Students turned toward her. Some nodded. Others looked at Caldwell, waiting to see how he would handle the disruption. His smile didn't falter, but the strain around his eyes betrayed him. Miss Thompson, he said smoothly, perhaps if you spent less time questioning authority and more time mastering fundamentals, you wouldn't be struggling in this course. A murmur rippled through the hall, not laughter this time, but discomfort. Rachel shrank back slightly, but the damage was done. The facade of Caldwell's authority had cracked. His dismissal hadn't silenced her. It had revealed him. Marcus didn't speak. He simply kept writing, line by line, until the board filled with the scaffolding of his solution. His hand moved with unshakable calm. the chalk steady, the rhythm like a heartbeat refusing to falter. The silence deepened. The students were no longer whispering doubts. They were watching something they weren't supposed to see. A man who wasn't meant to succeed, dismantling a trap built for his failure. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. He forced another smile, his words sharp but trembling at the edges. "Enjoy your moment, Mr. Hill. Halfway through, even the strongest stumble. Let's see if you survive the real test." But Marcus didn't falter. He reached the midpoint, where the problem's complexity peaked, the place where Caldwell had expected him to collapse. Instead, Marcus's substitutions flowed seamlessly, collapsing the chaos into clarity. The room held its breath. Caldwell's smirk, the mask he had worn so confidently, began to falter. Marcus reached the halfway point, and Caldwell's confident smile cracked for the first time. The lecture hall had changed. When Marcus first lifted the chalk, the air was heavy with derision. Smirks, chuckles, whispered predictions of failure. But now, halfway through the problem, those same whispers carried a different weight. Students weren't mocking anymore. They were stunned. The symbols on the board no longer looked like a trap. They looked like order unfolding, piece by piece, under Marcus's steady hand. "Wait, that works," a boy whispered in the third row, leaning closer to his notebook. "That step actually cancels out." Another muttered, "No way. He found a path I didn't even see." The tide had turned. Caldwell stood stiffly at the front, his arms still crossed but his posture betraying the strain. His smirk had cracked, its edges twitching, as if it required more energy now to hold it in place. He had orchestrated this problem to humiliate Marcus, but with every new line of chalk, it was his own authority that bent beneath the weight of scrutiny. Marcus didn't gloat. His expression remained calm, deliberate. He wasn't rushing for applause. Each step was for himself, for the years of dismissal, the voices that said he wasn't enough. And in his mind, those voices echoed. He remembered the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror, the way the officer's hand hovered on his holster as he demanded, "Where are you headed in that car?" He remembered being told at a job interview that his demeanor didn't quite fit the culture, though his qualifications were stronger than anyone else's in the room. He remembered the sideways glances in faculty lounges, the way conversations hushed when he walked in, the unspoken reminder, "You're tolerated, not welcome." Now, here he was, in the heart of their territory, reducing their trap into solvable fragments. He wasn't just solving for X, he was solving for dignity, line by line, proving that no amount of prejudice could erase his ability. The auditorium felt it. Students leaned forward, their skepticism dissolving into reluctant admiration. Even those who had laughed at first now scribbled furiously, trying to capture his method. Rachel Thompson, the engineering student who had spoken earlier, couldn't hide her smile. She had suffered Caldwell's dismissals more times than she cared to count, and watching Marcus carve through the problem felt like vindication. She whispered under her breath, almost as if reminding herself, "They can't ignore this, not this time." But Caldwell heard the shifting tide too. His fingers twitched at his sides, his jaw clenched, authority once unquestioned, now hung fragile in the balance. He forced himself forward, closing the distance to the board. His voice was sharp, condescending. "Careful, Mr. Hill. You've taken a dangerous turn here. One slip, and the entire solution collapses." The words weren't guidance. They were sabotage disguised as rigor. Marcus didn't look at him. "One slip doesn't erase the path," he said simply, his chalk moving with steady confidence. "It just means you start again." The students murmured, their eyes darting between Marcus and Caldwell. The balance of power was shifting, and they could see it. Caldwell's face flushed. He turned back toward the audience, forcing a chuckle. "Of course creativity is commendable, but mathematics is about discipline. Without credentials, without peer review, anyone can claim brilliance." The smile on his face was wide, but it was brittle, the kind of smile that stretched too far, hiding panic beneath its polish. The students didn't laugh this time. Silence answered him. Marcus pressed on, filling the board with clear, elegant steps that dismantled the complexity piece by piece. His back straightened, his hand unshaken. He wasn't proving this to Caldwell. He was proving it to himself, that every barrier, every dismissal, every systemic wall he'd faced, hadn't dulled his mind. Maya Williams, the student in the back who had recognized his shortcut, leaned forward with her hands clasped. Her chest rose and fell quickly, as though she herself were solving alongside him, and in her mind, a realization bloomed. This wasn't just about math. It was about seeing someone who looked like her, someone who had been underestimated, standing in defiance of the same dismissal she'd endured. The room was alive with whispers now, but they weren't of doubt, they were of awe. He's brilliant.
I can't believe it.
This isn't luck. He knows exactly what he's doing. Each whisper chipped away at Caldwell's authority. Each murmur made the room less his, more Marcus's. And then the unexpected twist came. A student in the front row, usually quiet, raised his hand hesitantly. Caldwell ignored it, but Marcus noticed. He paused, lowering the chalk. Go ahead. The boy swallowed nervously. Professor Caldwell always says there's only one clean path through problems like this. But you've shown at least 3 simplifications so far. Are there really multiple ways? The question wasn't meant to attack. It was genuine curiosity. But the effect was explosive.
The room shifted again.
Students looked at Caldwell now, waiting for his answer. His face stiffened, the smile still frozen but his eyes sharp with anger. Of course, there are variations, he said curtly. But some methods are more valid than others. Proper methods. The boy frowned. But his method works, doesn't it? The silence that followed was heavy, damning. Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line. He turned back to Marcus, his mask cracking. He needed to regain control, to remind them all that he was the authority here. But Marcus was already moving again, writing the next line. The symbols collapsed neatly, the chaos reduced into something elegant, undeniable. And with each stroke, Caldwell's pride unraveled. He wasn't just losing control of a classroom. He was losing the one thing he valued most. The auditorium no longer looked at him with awe. Their eyes were shifting, slowly, toward Marcus. Caldwell's breathing quickened. His palms itched. His smirk faltered completely, replaced with a twitching jaw. The laughter he once commanded had vanished. And then Marcus did something Caldwell hadn't expected. He paused, turned, looked directly at Caldwell. His voice was calm, but his words cut deeper than any insult. You said math doesn't care about stories, but right now the story is changing. The students gasped softly. Caldwell's face burned red, his polished demeanor finally shattering under the weight of exposure. For the first time in years, Dr. Stephen Caldwell felt his power slipping. His pride, his status, his authority, all of it was on trial. And in a sudden, explosive burst, he slammed his fist on the desk, the sound reverberating like a gunshot through the hall. His voice cracked as he shouted, raw and venomous. You'll never get it right. The sound of Caldwell's fist on the desk echoed long after the impact. It reverberated against the walls, down the rows of seats, and into the bones of every student in the auditorium. The sharp crack broke the illusion of civility, stripping away the professor's mask of calm authority. For the first time, his rage stood naked before them all. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The room felt suspended, like a held breath waiting to collapse. Marcus stood at the board, chalk still in his hand, his back straight. He didn't flinch. He didn't look at Caldwell. He simply stared at the half-solved equation in front of him, as if the professor's anger were no louder than a distant storm. His calmness unnerved the students even more than Caldwell's outburst. Because Marcus wasn't rattled. He wasn't broken. He was still standing. And in that silence, Rachel Thompson's heart pounded against her ribs. Rachel had been sitting quietly in the middle rows, notebook open but unused, her pen tapping nervously against the margin. She was 21, sharp and ambitious, but years of being under Caldwell's authority had taught her one lesson. Above all, silence was survival. She remembered her freshman year, when she had asked Caldwell a question after class, about an equation she didn't understand. His response hadn't been an answer, but a dismissal. Perhaps you should focus on simpler material, Miss Thompson. Not everyone is cut out for this level of work. The words had burned into her memory. Not cut out. He hadn't said it outright, but Rachel knew what he meant. He didn't see her, not as capable, not as equal, and she had swallowed that bitterness, burying her questions, avoiding his gaze, making herself smaller in every lecture. But now, watching Marcus stand firm under the same disdain, something inside her shifted. Her pen stilled, her breath caught. She realized she was watching not just a man solving an equation, but a man refusing to bow, refusing to let prejudice define him. His courage didn't diminish her. It demanded her own. Caldwell's voice cut the silence again, sharp and venomous. Enough theatrics. You don't belong here, Mr. Hill. Admit it before you embarrass yourself further. Marcus turned his head slowly, his expression calm but his eyes unflinching. I belong wherever truth exists. And right now the truth is on this board. The students murmured, unsettled by his quiet defiance. Caldwell's face flushed deeper, but before he could retort, another voice broke through the room, Rachel's voice. At first it was only a whisper. He's right. Her own ears startled her. She hadn't planned to speak, but the words had slipped past her lips before she could stop them. She felt heat rush to her cheeks as a few nearby students turned toward her. Caldwell snapped his head in her direction. Excuse me. Rachel swallowed hard, her throat dry. But then she lifted her chin, forcing her voice louder this time. I said, he's right. His method works. The auditorium stirred. Students shifted, glancing between her and Caldwell, their shock palpable. Caldwell's smile returned, sharp and cruel. Miss Thompson, he said slowly, savoring each syllable. I trust you've suddenly become an authority on advanced integration methods. Rachel's pulse raced. She wanted to shrink, to retreat back into silence. But Marcus's calm presence on the stage anchored her. She drew in a shaky breath. No, she said, steadying her voice. But I recognize the structure he's using. It's valid. It simplifies the problem faster than the traditional path. You'd know that if you weren't so focused on discrediting him. Gasps rippled through the auditorium. Some students covered their mouths. Others exchanged wide-eyed looks. No one had ever spoken to Caldwell like that. Not a student, and certainly not one of his own. Marcus didn't turn, but his shoulders straightened, as though her words had added invisible weight to his resolve. Caldwell's face darkened. His smile was still plastered on, but his eyes burned. Careful, Miss Thompson. One poorly chosen word can define your academic career. I would hate to see yours cut short. The threat hung in the air, icy and heavy. A few students shifted uncomfortably, their silence betraying their complicity. Rachel's stomach churned. She knew the danger in standing up to him. Caldwell had power over grades, recommendations, opportunities. But then she thought of every time she had swallowed her voice, every time she had sat in silence while he dismissed her, and others like her. Not this time. Her voice rang out, louder now, cutting through the air with sharp clarity. With all due respect, Professor, he's right. The auditorium erupted with whispers. The tension snapped like a live wire. Marcus finally turned, his eyes meeting Rachel's across the room. For a moment, there was no chalk, no equation, no professor, only a silent acknowledgement between them. Gratitude flickered in his gaze, quiet but unmistakable. Caldwell's jaw clenched. His fists curled at his sides. His face flushed red, not with the calm flush of authority, but with the raw heat of exposed pride. For years he had dominated this room, unchallenged, untouchable, and now, one of his own students, one he had dismissed countless times, had sided with the man he was trying to destroy. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His authority, once absolute, was crumbling. And Rachel, trembling but resolute, did not look away. Caldwell's face turned red, as Rachel declared steady and defiant. He's right, Professor. The room was electric, charged with the kind of silence that wasn't passive but alive, vibrating with unspoken tension. Rachel's words, he's right, Professor, still hung in the air like a crack in glass, spreading across the auditorium. Students stared at her in disbelief, then at Marcus, then at Caldwell, as though waiting to see whether the crack would shatter or hold. Caldwell's face was rigid, red from the effort of containing his fury. His lips curled into something that resembled a smile but carried none of its warmth. He looked like a man clinging to a rope fraying in his hands. Marcus, meanwhile, returned to the board. His expression hadn't changed, calm, deliberate, steady, but inside he felt the shift. Rachel's voice had cut through the silence that so often shielded men like Caldwell. It was no longer Marcus alone against the weight of dismissal. A new thread of solidarity had been woven into the room. The chalk moved again, scratching softly across the board. Line by line, Marcus built toward the heart of the problem. His movements were slower now, more deliberate, as though he were setting up something unseen, something that required precision, not just in math, but in timing. Students leaned forward, their notebooks forgotten. The air felt heavy, like the pause before a storm. Caldwell, desperate to reassert control, spoke up again. Mr. Hill, I do hope you realize that your current path leads nowhere. You've managed some clever simplifications, but soon you'll reach the dead end. Everyone does. He chuckled, a hollow sound that failed to mask his growing panic. Marcus didn't respond. He added another line, carefully transforming the structure of the equation. For a moment, it still looked messy, even to the sharpest eyes in the room. But then, with a single substitution, everything shifted. It was subtle at first. A fraction canceled out where none should have. A nested function unfolded into something clean, almost elegant. The board, once crowded with chaos, began to reveal a startling symmetry. Gasps broke the silence. Wait, did he just? One student whispered. That's impossible. That shouldn't work. No, it's right, look at it. The realization spread like fire through dry grass. Marcus hadn't just been solving the problem. He had uncovered a hidden step, a method buried so deeply within the problem's complexity that few would even think to attempt it. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was mastery. Rachel's eyes widened, her hand pressed against her notebook as though steadying herself. She understood what she was seeing. Marcus hadn't merely matched Caldwell's problem. He had outmaneuvered it. Caldwell's smirk collapsed into something tighter, brittle. His hands gripped the edge of the desk. His mind raced. He hadn't anticipated this. The problem had been his weapon, his trap, and Marcus had turned it inside out, exposing the flaw in the design. The professor's voice, when it came, was strained. Coincidence. A trick of notation. But he stopped. The room wasn't listening to him anymore. Every pair of eyes was locked on Marcus. On the board. On the solution unfolding in ways they had never seen. Marcus paused briefly, chalk in hand, and finally turned his head toward the room. His voice was quiet but carried through the silence. Sometimes the hardest problems are only impossible because we've been taught to see them in one way. Change the view and the solution appears. The words weren't just about the math. Everyone in the room felt it. They were about the problem on the board, and the problem in the world outside this classroom. A chill rippled through the audience. For the first time, students weren't just admiring his intellect. They were understanding the deeper point, the quiet defiance embedded in every stroke of chalk. And then something happened that no one expected. Caldwell moved. He pushed himself off the desk and strode toward the board, his polished shoes striking hard against the tile. His face was flushed, his jaw tight. The smile he wore now was grotesque, stretched too wide, revealing the raw desperation beneath. Enough? He snapped. He snatched the chalk from Marcus's hand, nearly breaking it in half. If you insist on misleading these students with theatrics, let me show you the proper way. Gasps rippled again. Students leaned back, caught between awe and discomfort. Marcus didn't resist. He stepped aside, calm, his eyes never leaving Caldwell. The professor turned to the board, chalk poised, ready to reclaim his authority. He spoke with venom, his words rapid, defensive. Observe, class. The correct method begins here. He began writing furiously, lines of notation spilling across the board. His hand moved quickly, aggressively, as though speed alone could prove superiority. For a moment, some students nodded, reassured by the performance. But then the cracks showed. Halfway through his demonstration, Caldwell hesitated. A frown creased his face. His chalk hovered over the board, uncertain. He backtracked, erasing one line, then rewriting it, then erasing it again. Students exchanged glances. Murmurs rose. Wait, that doesn't look right. Did he just make the same substitution twice? He's stuck. Caldwell's hand trembled slightly. He pressed forward, but the more he wrote, the less sense it made. His solution tangled into contradictions, each correction only deepening the mess. The room shifted. Authority no longer sat with the professor at the board, but with the man who had stepped aside, quietly watching. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply waited, patient and calm, as the truth unraveled itself before the room. Rachel whispered under her breath, not daring to smile but unable to contain the awe in her voice. He's stumbling, and stumble Caldwell did. His lines overlapped. His steps contradicted themselves. Until finally, the chalk snapped in his hand with a sharp crack. He froze, breathing heavily, his face crimson. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't nervous laughter or suppressed whispers. It was recognition. The students knew what they had just seen. The trap had backfired. Caldwell, The man who prided himself on humiliating others had stumbled publicly, his authority exposed as fragile, and Marcus Hill, the history teacher, stood steady, the problem still within his grasp. Marcus stepped forward slowly, picking up the broken piece of chalk from Caldwell's hand. His voice was low, measured, but it cut through the silence like glass. "Even the proper way can fail," he said quietly. "Sometimes the truth demands a different path." The words weren't just for the board. They were for the man beside him, for the students, for every silent witness in the room. Caldwell's chest rose and fell rapidly, his breath audible. His eyes darted across the room, desperate for validation, for laughter, for someone, anyone, to rescue his pride. But no one did. The balance of power had shifted completely. The room no longer belonged to him. And in his desperation, Caldwell did the unthinkable. He lunged forward, grabbing the chalk again, as though forcing another attempt would erase what had just happened. But his movements were clumsy now, his notations contradicting themselves before they even reached the line. His hand shook, his face burned, and his mask of authority disintegrated before their eyes. Caldwell stumbled over his own math, his authority collapsing with each broken line on the board. The chalk fragments lay scattered at Caldwell's feet like pieces of broken pride. His breath came shallow and sharp, his once confident hand now trembling as he stood before the mangled mess of symbols he had scrawled across the board. The clean elegance he prided himself on was gone, replaced by overlapping strokes, contradictions, and jagged erasures that screamed desperation. The audience saw it. They couldn't unsee it. The image of their professor, the man who had built his reputation on humiliating others, now flustered, stumbling, exposed. His carefully cultivated mask of superiority had cracked wide open, and the ugliness underneath was visible to everyone. For years students had endured Caldwell's arrogance, his sly dismissals, his mockery disguised as mentorship. Many had laughed along, some out of fear, others out of habit, letting his cruelty pass as part of the academic game. But now the game was over. The curtain had been pulled back, and the man they once revered as untouchable was faltering under the weight of his own arrogance. Marcus, still standing calmly to the side, felt the shift. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't needed to. His silence was more powerful than Caldwell's frantic erasures. He stepped forward slowly, not to gloat, but to finish what had been started. The students leaned forward, their eyes wide, hearts pounding. They had never seen Caldwell like this, red-faced, defensive, scrambling. They had never seen someone stand so quietly, so steadily, against him. Caldwell, desperate to claw back some fragment of authority, turned abruptly, his voice rising in a strained attempt at control. "You don't understand," he snapped, pointing toward Marcus, as though he were the one responsible for the chaos on the board. "He's misleading you. He's not trained, not published, not..." But the words rang hollow. The students weren't nodding, they weren't laughing, they weren't clapping for his authority. Their eyes had shifted away from him, back to Marcus. And Marcus finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Respectability is not the same as truth." The line cut through the room like glass shattering. The students flinched, not because of its volume, but because of its weight. Caldwell's face contorted. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, but he had no rebuttal. His respectability, his position, his power, none of it could mask the undeniable evidence on the board. Rachel, sitting in the middle rows, felt her chest tighten. She thought of all the times Caldwell had silenced her, dismissed her questions, brushed off her insights. She thought of how she had internalized that dismissal, shrinking herself to fit his expectation. Now, watching Marcus dismantle him with nothing but calm persistence, she realized just how false that respectability had always been. The room buzzed with whispers. "He's..." "Caldwell's wrong. He's actually wrong. Marcus is solving it. He's really solving it." Caldwell snapped. "Enough." He slammed the chalk down so hard, it broke again, shards scattering across the desk. His voice cracked with raw anger. "This man is not a mathematician. He is a history teacher. He does not belong here, not in this department, not in front of this board, not..." But his words cut off, strangled by the silence that followed, because Marcus had already moved. Without raising his voice, without looking at Caldwell, he picked up another piece of chalk. His hand moved smoothly, almost gently, erasing Caldwell's tangled errors, and continuing where his own solution had left off. The students watched in stunned silence. There was no hesitation in his movements, no anger, No need to shout. He simply continued the work, as though Caldwell's tirade were nothing more than background noise. And it was in that moment that the true shift occurred. The power no longer belonged to Caldwell. It no longer belonged to his title, his tenure, his reputation. It belonged to Marcus, to the man whose worth had been dismissed, whose abilities had been doubted, whose presence had been questioned. He was the authority now, not because of position, but because of truth. Line by line, the equation unraveled under his hand. Where Caldwell's writing had been frantic and defensive, Marcus's was calm, clean, undeniable. Each stroke was steady, building toward the inevitable conclusion. The whispers grew louder. He's doing it. That's the solution. No way. Caldwell couldn't even. Caldwell stood frozen, his face pale now, the fury draining into something closer to fear. He had lost control. He had lost the room. He had lost the illusion he had spent decades building. And Marcus didn't need to say it. The board was saying it for him. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. She hadn't expected. Not sadness, but a release. The release of years of silence, of watching authority go unchallenged. She whispered under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. They can't deny this. Not this time. Marcus paused briefly, glancing at the rows of students. His gaze swept across their faces, not seeking validation, but reminding them of what they were seeing. He didn't need applause. He didn't need praise. He needed them to remember. Caldwell's chest heaved. He took a step forward, then stopped, his legs stiff, his lips parted as though to speak. But no words came. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say. And Marcus, steady as ever, pressed on. His final lines simplified, collapsing the complexity into something startlingly simple, elegant, undeniable. The equation was no longer a weapon. It was proof. Proof that brilliance could not be buried. Proof that bias could not erase truth. Proof that dignity could not be stolen by dismissal. The silence in the room was complete now. Even the whispers had died. Marcus stepped back, the chalk still in his hand. For a moment, he simply looked at the board, at the solution he had built, line by line. His chest rose and fell, but his face remained calm, composed. And then, with a steady hand, he drew a box around the final solution. The sound of chalk enclosing that answer was louder than any outburst, any fist slammed on a desk, any cruel word. It was final. It was undeniable. The room erupted, not with laughter, not with mockery, but with gasps, with stunned silence turned to awe. Marcus lowered the chalk, his hand steady, his voice calm. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He didn't need to, because the room already knew what had happened. The mask of respectability had shattered, and in its place the truth stood tall, written in chalk. With a final stroke of chalk, Marcus boxed the correct solution, silencing the room. The chalk squeaked as Marcus drew the final box around his solution, its lines straight, unshakable. The sound echoed into the silence like the closing of a door Caldwell had tried to slam in his face, now shut by Marcus's own steady hand. The auditorium was still. Dozens of faces stared at the board, the neat, undeniable answer standing in defiance of everything they had expected. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. For the first time since the lecture began, the room didn't belong to Caldwell. It belonged to Marcus Hill. The whispers began softly, rippling from the edges. He solved it. He really solved it. Caldwell couldn't even. The words spread like wildfire. A wave of admiration rolled through the hall, tinged with disbelief. But beneath that admiration lay something else. Shame. Shame that so many had laughed, smirked, or stayed silent while watching a man be set up to fail. Caldwell stood rigid at the side of the board, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. His polished superiority was gone. In its place was a red flush of humiliation he could not hide. He had built his reputation on control, on wielding intellect like a sword, and now that sword lay shattered at his feet. Marcus, however, did not revel in it. He didn't need to. He simply stepped back from the board, his face calm, his chest rising and falling with measured breaths. He knew the whispers weren't just about the problem. They were about him, about who he was, about what he had just proven. And yet in that moment, the truth of his brilliance wasn't new. It wasn't born in that lecture hall. It had been there all along, buried under years of dismissal and denial. Marcus's mind flickered back, unbidden, to his youth. He was 14, sitting in a cramped classroom with peeling paint and buzzing fluorescent lights. His math teacher, Mr. Ackerman, had written a problem on the board, one meant to stump the entire class. Marcus had solved it in less than 5 minutes, his pencil flying across the page. When he turned in his work, Mr. Ackerman didn't smile. He didn't praise him. He held up Marcus's paper and said, "In front of everyone, you copied this. Don't insult me." Marcus remembered the heat in his cheeks, the sting in his chest as the class laughed. He hadn't cheated. He had seen the solution like a pattern unfolding. But no one believed him. Years later, at 16, he had entered a statewide math competition. He advanced round after round, until the final, where he stunned the judges with a flawless proof, second place. Not first, second. And when he overheard one of the judges whispering to another, "Can't give it to him. People will ask questions," Marcus understood. His brilliance wasn't enough. His skin was louder than his work. By 18, he had applied for scholarships in mathematics. He had the grades, the scores, the awards. But one rejection letter after another arrived in the mail. Each one praised his dedication, but concluded with the same line, "We regret to inform you." And then, one day, a professor he admired pulled him aside. The man smiled, but his words were daggers. "Marcus, you're talented, no doubt, but math is a field where respect matters, as much as skill. You might find more acceptance in history. Your perspective could be useful there." Useful. Acceptance. Words dressed as advice but carrying the weight of exclusion. So he turned to history. Not because he couldn't do math, but because math had been stolen from him. Because every door that should have been open had been slammed shut by hands that looked like Caldwell. Because history at least gave him the chance to preserve voices, erased by the same system trying to erase his own. Back in the lecture hall, Marcus stood tall. The board bore proof of his buried talent. Proof that brilliance denied was brilliance not erased, but merely hidden. The whispers in the auditorium grew louder, heavier. Students leaned forward, no longer doubting, no longer mocking, but wondering how they had ever believed otherwise. Rachel felt her throat tighten. She thought of herself, of the questions she hadn't asked, the hands she hadn't raised, the silence she had chosen. She saw in Marcus not just a teacher but a mirror of every student who had been told they weren't enough. Caldwell's voice finally broke through, strained and brittle. "Do not mistake theatrics for scholarship." The words were weak. Even he heard it. Maya, from the back row, whispered fiercely, "That wasn't theatrics. That was genius." A murmur of agreement rippled. Caldwell's mask was crumbling further. Marcus glanced at him briefly, then turned back to the students. His voice was calm, carrying weight without volume. "Talent doesn't disappear. It doesn't vanish because someone says you don't belong. It survives. Sometimes it survives buried, waiting for a moment like this." The students hung on his words. Caldwell tried to step in again, but his tongue caught. His face was pale now, drained of the arrogance that had once seemed unshakable. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the twist came. A voice from the back row, loud, clear, unfiltered, cut through the silence.
"Why isn't he the professor?"
The room froze. Heads turned. Gasps escaped lips. The words reverberated like a hammer against stone, splitting the silence open. Caldwell's eyes widened, the red flush returning to his cheeks. His authority, his superiority, his identity as the untouchable professor, all of it crumbled under that single, undeniable question. Marcus stood still, the chalk dust still clinging to his fingers, as the weight of the moment settled over the room. As whispers of admiration spread, the voice echoed again from the back. Why isn't he the professor? The question, "Why isn't he the professor?" lingered long after the lecture ended. It had been more than a question. It was a verdict. It echoed down the halls, whispered in dining rooms, scribbled in notes passed between classes. For students, the confrontation wasn't just an academic exercise anymore. It was a revelation. By the end of the day, the story had spread across campus. Snippets of video clips captured on phones. Marcus calmly boxing the solution. Caldwell fumbling with the chalk, circulated in group chats. Threads exploded on student forums. History teacher schools Caldwell in front of everyone. Marcus Hill solves problem Caldwell couldn't. Why is this man not teaching math here? But the more the students celebrated, the more uneasy the faculty became. Universities thrive on appearances, and nothing tarnished the appearance of authority more than exposure. It wasn't Marcus's brilliance that unsettled them. It was that his brilliance had come at the expense of someone they relied on. Caldwell had been humiliated publicly, and humiliation at that level was contagious. If one professor could be dethroned, others could too. The institution couldn't let that seed grow. By the next morning, Marcus received an email.
Mr. Hill,
The university administration requests your presence for a review of your recent guest lecture. There are concerns regarding professional conduct and boundaries of discipline. Please report to the Faculty Oversight Committee at 3. The words were sterile, professional, cold, but their meaning was clear. This wasn't recognition. It was retaliation. Marcus stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He had seen this before, not in this exact form, but in the patterns of his life, the way systems responded, not by acknowledging truth, but by preserving hierarchy. Institutions rarely protected those humiliated. They protected those with power. He arrived at the meeting room that afternoon. The hallways felt colder than usual, students avoiding his eyes as he walked. Some whispered encouragement, but most turned away. Their silence was familiar, not cruelty, but fear. The Faculty Oversight Committee sat at a long table, 5 members in suits and polished shoes. Their expressions were neutral masks, faces carved from stone. Caldwell sat at the far end, his hands folded neatly, his smirk faint but unmistakable. The chair of the committee, a thin man with rimless glasses, began, "Mr. Hill, thank you for joining us. We've received several reports regarding yesterday's lecture. While your intent may have been educational, there are concerns about overstepping boundaries. As a guest lecturer in history, it was inappropriate to take over a mathematics demonstration." Marcus's brow furrowed. "I was challenged publicly. I responded publicly. I did not take over. I defended myself." The woman beside the chair leaned forward, her tone smooth, condescending. "Regardless of circumstances, it's been suggested that your conduct undermined a senior faculty member in front of students. That reflects poorly on the institution." Marcus's chest tightened. Poorly on the institution. Not poorly on Caldwell. Not poorly on truth. On the institution. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "So when I was mocked, interrupted, and baited into humiliation, that was acceptable. But when I responded with the truth, that was unacceptable." The room shifted uncomfortably. One of the members cleared his throat. "This isn't about race, Mr. Hill. It's about protocol." But Marcus knew the code in their words. Protocol was just the language power used when it wanted to keep its order intact. Caldwell finally spoke, his voice smooth, measured, dripping with false humility. "I bear no ill will toward Mr. Hill. Truly, I don't. But the fact remains that he disrupted a mathematics lecture, misleading students into believing unconventional methods were correct. It is my duty as an educator to protect academic integrity." The smirk that flickered at the corner of his lips betrayed him. Marcus's hands curled into fists beneath the table. He had dismantled Caldwell's problem piece by piece, shown his method clean and precise. Yet here was Caldwell, framing himself as the guardian of rigor, the victim of misconduct. The chair nodded. "Yes, that is precisely our concern. Mr. Hill, this committee must decide whether your presence on campus as a guest lecturer is in the best interest of the university moving forward." The weight of the words landed heavily. Marcus felt the sting, but he didn't flinch. He had endured this before. Opportunities dangled, then snatched away. Recognition promised, then revoked. Systems always found a way to bury inconvenient brilliance. Still, his voice was calm, though his chest burned. "You are punishing me not for my actions, but for exposing yours." The committee stiffened. Silence pressed against the walls. The statement was bold, dangerous, but it was also true. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, satisfaction flickering in his eyes. For all the cracks in his authority yesterday, here was the safety net, the institution itself. He didn't need to win the students anymore. He had bureaucracy on his side. The meeting dragged on, filled with sterile words. Discipline, integrity, standards. Each phrase was a shield, a way of disguising power as principle. Marcus answered every question with quiet precision, but he could feel the outcome long before it was spoken. By the time he left the room, the sun had dipped low, shadows stretching across the quad. Students passed by in clusters, laughing, talking, their lives unchanged. Marcus walked alone, his heart heavy, but his back straight. He knew what was coming. The next morning, the university released a statement. "We value diversity of thought, and cross-disciplinary collaboration. However, faculty guests must adhere to the boundaries of their invited role. While we appreciate Mr. Hill's contributions, his actions exceeded the scope of his position. We will be reviewing future guest lecture opportunities. The message was clear. Marcus was out. The students reacted instantly. Some protested online, posting clips of the lecture, demanding answers. Others debated in heated forums, some defending Caldwell, others championing Marcus. But the administration stood firm, their polished language unmoved by outrage. Marcus sat alone in his apartment that night, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating his face. He scrolled through the messages. Encouragement, anger, disbelief. But one thread stood out. They're trying to bury him. Just like always. The words hit deep. Yes, just like always. And yet, as heavy as it felt, Marcus refused to crumble. He had been buried before, but buried things sometimes grew roots. Back in his office, Caldwell leaned in his chair, the smirk fully restored. His colleagues congratulated him on handling the situation with grace. His students avoided challenging him, the memory of his outburst fading beneath the authority of his title. He had his mask back, not by truth, but by power. And when he looked in the mirror that night, his smile widened. Caldwell smirked again, this time with bureaucratic power on his side. The smirk on Caldwell's face lingered long after Marcus left the committee room. But outside, the story refused to stay contained. By the next morning, the campus buzzed like a hive. Students whispered in dining halls, passed phone screens back and forth in crowded lecture rooms, and stopped strangers on sidewalks just to ask, "Have you seen it?" The video clips of Marcus at the board had escaped the walls of the auditorium and taken root online. First on the campus message boards, then Twitter, then TikTok. Each platform added its own captions and edits. But the story was always the same. A black history teacher solves an impossible calculus problem, humiliating a professor who tried to embarrass him. One clip focused on Marcus's calm voice. Sometimes the hardest problems are only impossible because we've been taught to see them in one way. Another showed Caldwell fumbling with the chalk, his hand trembling, while Marcus stood silently, steady as stone. By noon, the hashtag #NotMarcusTeach was trending locally. By evening, it had spread further. Rachel Thompson scrolled through her phone in disbelief. She had been one of the first to post the video, her caption raw with anger. "I watched this man solve what our professor couldn't. Why is the institution punishing him instead of celebrating him?" Her post had exploded. Thousands of likes, hundreds of comments. Some praised Marcus's brilliance. Others tore into Caldwell's arrogance. And still others raised the bigger question. Why are black scholars still fighting to be recognized in spaces that claim to value knowledge? Rachel sat in the student union, surrounded by a small circle of classmates who leaned over her shoulders, drafting petitions, creating flyers, planning demonstrations. She had never thought of herself as an organizer, but Marcus's courage had lit a fire in her. "We need numbers," one student said urgently. "If the administration sees this is bigger than one man, they can't bury it." Rachel nodded, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "I'll start the petition tonight. Reinstate Marcus Hill and hold Caldwell accountable." Short, sharp, undeniable. Within hours, signatures poured in. 500, 1,000, by the next morning, 3,000. But the administration remained silent. Marcus sat in his small apartment, the glow of his laptop illuminating his tired face. He scrolled through the petitions, the hashtags, the messages flooding his inbox. Strangers called him a hero. Students called him a role model. Parents called him an inspiration. And yet, beneath it all, he felt the weight of something darker. The silence of power. Because for every hashtag trending online, there was a file sitting on a desk in the administration building. For every message of support, there was a polished statement being drafted to frame him as unprofessional. Marcus knew how this worked. He had lived long enough to see how systems responded when their own were exposed. The louder the people shouted, the quieter the institution grew, until at the last possible moment, it spoke with finality. The disciplinary hearing loomed only days away. Rachel noticed the tension on campus shift. Students were energized, their protests growing louder, but faculty members grew colder. Some avoided Marcus entirely. Others shook their heads, muttering about professionalism and boundaries. Even those who privately admired him refused to stand up publicly. One afternoon, Rachel confronted a professor outside her engineering lecture. You saw the video. You know Marcus was right. Why won't you say anything? The professor's eyes darted nervously to the hallway cameras before lowering his voice. Because tenure protects him, not me. If I speak against Caldwell, my career is over. You don't fight institutions by shouting. You survive them by staying silent. Rachel walked away with fire in her chest. Survival at the cost of silence was something Marcus had endured his whole life. But now she thought silence was complicity. She poured her anger into action. By the third night, rallies filled the campus quad. Handmade signs waved in the air. Truth, tenure, knowledge has no color. Marcus Hill belongs here. Videos of the rallies went viral too. Clips of students chanting Marcus's name. Clips of Rachel standing on a bench with a megaphone. Her voice raw as she shouted, "They are punishing a man for being brilliant. They are punishing him for being black." The crowds roared. Still, Marcus sat quietly in his apartment, watching it unfold. He admired Rachel's courage, the students' passion. But he knew the truth. Time was running out. The hearing was set for Friday. Today was Wednesday. 2 days. He closed his laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He thought of his mother, who had always told him, "Don't let them silence you. Even if your voice shakes, let it speak." But what if his voice wasn't enough? What if this was bigger than hashtags, bigger than petitions? What if the institution had already decided his fate? Thursday morning, the official notice arrived in his inbox. "Mr. Hill, your disciplinary hearing is scheduled for Friday at 10:00 a.m. Attendance is mandatory. Failure to appear will result in automatic termination of your guest role and removal from university premises." The words were final, sterile, void of empathy. Marcus closed his laptop slowly, his chest tightening. This was it. 2 days. 2 days to prepare, to defend himself, to face a system that had never once chosen his side. That night, Rachel called him. "They're scared," she said urgently. "That's why they're doing this. But you're not alone, Marcus. We'll be outside the hearing. Hundreds of us. They can't bury you if we're watching." Marcus was silent for a moment, his throat tightening. Finally, he whispered, "Thank you." But as he hung up, the weight of it all pressed down harder. Hundreds of students outside wouldn't change the fact that 5 administrators inside held his future in their hands. The hours ticked by. Midnight passed. The night dragged on. By dawn, Marcus hadn't slept. He sat at his desk, papers scattered, drafting notes not for defense but for truth. If they were going to silence him, he would make sure his voice echoed first. Friday morning arrived heavy with rain. Students gathered outside the administration building, their umbrellas forming a sea of color, as they chanted Marcus's name. The sound carried through the stone halls, muffled but undeniable. Inside, Marcus sat in a waiting room alone. The clock ticked loudly. Every second felt like a countdown, not just to a hearing but to a verdict already written. And then, just hours before the hearing, his laptop chimed. An email. Unexpected, from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line froze him where he sat. "Evidence you'll need. Read before the hearing." Marcus's chest tightened as he clicked open the email, its first line burning into his eyes. The rain hadn't stopped all morning. It tapped against the tall glass windows of the administration building, steady and relentless, as if echoing the chants outside. Hundreds of students had gathered in the courtyard, their umbrellas forming a restless sea of color. Their voices rose in unison, pounding through the walls. "Let Marcus teach! Let Marcus teach!" Inside, the atmosphere was starkly different. The disciplinary hearing room was a study in formality. Long mahogany table polished to a shine, leather chairs aligned with rigid precision. A flag in the corner. Every detail screamed authority, permanence, control. Marcus sat alone at one end of the table, his posture calm but his chest tight with the weight of every eye on him. Across from him sat the Faculty Oversight Committee. 5 figures, their expressions carved into neutrality, faces unreadable. And to Marcus's left, seated with polished confidence, was Dr. Stephen Caldwell. He looked restored, the mask of professionalism firmly back in place. His suit was pressed, his tie crisp, his hair combed to silver perfection. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that disguised venom as civility. The chair of the committee cleared his throat. "We are here to address concerns regarding Mr. Marcus Hill's conduct during a guest lecture on campus. Dr. Caldwell, as the reporting faculty member, you may present your case first." Caldwell stood smoothly, sliding a stack of neatly typed papers across the table. His voice was calm, rehearsed, dripping with the polish of a man accustomed to control. Thank you, Chair. What transpired in my lecture hall was not simply a matter of intellectual debate. It was an undermining of order, professionalism, and the standards we uphold as an institution. Hill, though invited to speak on history, hijacked a mathematics lecture, misleading students, with unorthodox methods, and publicly attempting to discredit a senior faculty member. He paused, letting the words sink in. The cadence was perfect, practiced enough to sound effortless, heavy enough to sound damning. While some may have found his theatrics entertaining, Caldwell continued, we must ask ourselves, do we value scholarship or spectacle? Do we preserve standards, or do we allow disorder to reign, simply because it is momentarily popular? I submit that Miss Hill's actions were unprofessional, inappropriate, and detrimental to the reputation of this university. The committee members nodded subtly, their pens scratching against paper. Caldwell sat down, folding his hands neatly, the faint smirk flickering at the corners of his mouth. Marcus sat still, his jaw tight. He had expected nothing less. Caldwell hadn't spoken the truth of what happened. He had spoken the truth institutions preferred, order over honesty, hierarchy over justice. The chair turned to him. Mr. Hill, you may respond. Marcus rose slowly, his palms pressing against the table. His heart pounded, but his voice, when it came, was steady, carrying the quiet weight of lived truth. I did not hijack a lecture, he began. I was challenged publicly. I responded publicly. I did not undermine anyone. I defended myself against a man who has spent his career undermining others. Caldwell shifted, his smirk hardening. Marcus continued, for years I have lived under the shadow of dismissal. I was accused of cheating as a child, because I solved problems too quickly. I was denied scholarships, told to stay in my lane, advised to study fields where my face might be more acceptable. That didn't happen in isolation. It happened in classrooms, in institutions like this one. The room shifted uncomfortably. When I stood in that lecture hall, Marcus said, I was not performing theatrics. I was proving, not to Dr. Caldwell, not even to myself, but to the students, that brilliance does not belong to one race, one discipline, or one department. I did what I have done my entire life. I refused to be silent. His voice cracked slightly, but he did not stop. And yet, here I am. Not celebrated, but investigated. Not acknowledged, but threatened. Why? Because I exposed what was never meant to be seen. Because I dared to show truth in a space where truth was inconvenient. The words hung heavy in the air. The committee's pen slowed. One of the members, a woman with short gray hair, raised her eyes from her notes, watching him more closely now. Caldwell leaned forward, his smile sharpened. Moving speech, Mr. Hill. But sentiment is not evidence. What these students recorded, what has gone viral, are fragments, stripped of context, easily manipulated. The board must decide not based on sympathy, but on proof. And proof, Mr. Hill, is something you lack. The dig landed like a knife. A few committee members nodded faintly. The weight of bureaucracy was on Caldwell's side, but Marcus's hand tightened around the folder in front of him. He remembered the email. The night before, when exhaustion had nearly overtaken him, the message had arrived. Evidence you'll need. Read before the hearing. Attached were video files, longer and clearer than the clips circulating online. One of them had been recorded from the very front row. It showed everything. Caldwell's interruptions, his mockery, his outburst, and Marcus's calm, methodical solution. Marcus hadn't planned to use it. He knew how evidence was twisted, how institutions minimized what was plain. But now, with Caldwell's smirk taunting him, with the committee hanging on the word proof, he felt the moment rising. He drew in a slow breath. I have more than sentiment, he said quietly. The room stilled. Caldwell's smirk flickered. Marcus reached into his folder, sliding the printed transcript of the email across the table. I have proof. Proof of what really happened in that lecture hall. Proof that I was not disruptive, but disrespected. Proof that the only disorder in that room came from Dr. Caldwell himself. The committee members leaned forward. One of them adjusted his glasses, scanning the document quickly. Caldwell shifted in his seat. His face pale now, his polished calm starting to falter. That's fabricated. He can't. But Marcus's voice cut through, calm and unflinching. Every interruption, every dismissal, every word, it's all on record. The students outside chanted louder, their voices echoing faintly through the glass. Let Marcus teach. Inside, the tension thickened. The committee shuffled papers, exchanging quick glances. Caldwell's face burned red, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Finally, the chair cleared his throat. His voice was measured, but his eyes betrayed unease. Mr. Hill, do you have any proof to present to this board? The room fell silent as Marcus placed the flash drive on the table, the question hanging in the air like a gavel. Do you have any proof? The question still hung in the air. Do you have any proof? The board's eyes bored into Marcus, expecting hesitation, expecting silence. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, the faintest smirk twitching at the corner of his lips again, certain Marcus would falter. But Marcus didn't move alone. From the gallery seats behind him, where students had squeezed into every corner the committee would allow, Rachel Thompson stood, her voice firm and clear cut through the stale formality of the room. He does, she said. We all do. Gasps rippled across the chamber. Dozens of students rose to their feet beside her, phones raised high, screens glowing with evidence. Clips played in sync. Caldwell's interruptions, his mocking tone, his fist slamming the desk, his errors unraveling on the board. The room filled with the sound of overlapping recordings, voices and images merging into undeniable truth. The committee scrambled. Papers rustled. Chairs shifted, the illusion of control slipping from their hands. One member gestured sharply. Silence. This is irregular. But the room could not be silenced. Rachel's voice rang out again, louder, unshaken. You asked for proof. Here it is. We were there. We saw it. And we will not let you erase it. Marcus turned slowly, his chest tightening at the sight. Row after row of students stood, their faces resolute, their voices echoing one another. It wasn't just Rachel. It wasn't just Maya in the back, or the boy who had dared to question Caldwell's one right path. It was dozens of them, their silence broken, their complicity shattered. The chair of the committee looked flustered, his rimless glasses slipping down his nose. Order. This is highly irregular. Student testimony is not. Rachel cut him off, her words sharp with conviction. Irregular is punishing the truth while protecting the lie. Irregular is letting bias masquerade as scholarship. You've hidden behind rules long enough. Today, rules won't save you. The students erupted in applause, their hands clapping, their voices rising. The room thundered with energy, rattling the polished veneer of authority. Caldwell's mask cracked fully now. He rose from his seat, his face crimson. This is nonsense. These are children, swayed by emotion, incapable of understanding the standards of academic rigor. Their so-called evidence is meaningless. But Rachel's phone kept playing, and Maya's, and dozens more. Caldwell's voice mocking Marcus's credentials, dismissing his notation, sneering. You'll never get it right, echoed on loop, louder and louder, until his denial was drowned in his own words. The board members shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, they couldn't hide behind polished statements or sterile procedure. The truth wasn't confined to Marcus's folder or his flash drive. It was alive, undeniable, multiplied across dozens of witnesses, who refused to be silent. Marcus stood still, his face calm, his hands clasped before him. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't begged. He hadn't raged. He had let truth do what it always did, if given time, reveal itself. The chair finally exhaled, the weight of inevitability pressing on his shoulders. He spoke slowly, carefully, but his voice lacked the certainty it once carried. The committee will need time to review this evidence. Clearly, the situation is more complex than initially presented. Caldwell snapped. Complex? It is not complex. He is a fraud, an intruder. Enough. The word came not from Marcus, nor from the students, but from the gray-haired woman on the board, who had been silent until now. Her voice was sharp, unyielding. We have heard enough. All eyes turned to her. She looked at Caldwell, her expression hard. This committee cannot, in good conscience, ignore what we have seen. Dr. Caldwell, your conduct was unacceptable. Your hostility, your loss of composure, your inability to uphold the dignity of your own classroom. It is all on record. Caldwell froze. His mouth opened, then closed, no words forming. The students erupted again, cheers echoing against the walls. Rachel's eyes burned with tears, not of sadness but of vindication. For the first time, the institution had acknowledged what they had all witnessed. A chair cleared his throat again, his tone reluctant. As for Mr. Hill, the committee recognizes that his actions were not in violation of university policy. While he may have exceeded his role as a guest, it was in direct response to provocation. The words hung like an official decree. Marcus had not been silenced. But the victory was not his alone. It was shared, with Rachel, with Maya, with every student who had chosen to raise their voice instead of staying silent. Caldwell collapsed back into his chair, his smirk gone, his authority shattered. For years he had ruled by fear, by dismissal, by bias disguised as rigor, and in one afternoon, that mask had crumbled beyond repair. The room buzzed with energy, relief, and disbelief. Students filmed every second, their cameras capturing history as it unfolded. Marcus had not only solved a problem on a chalkboard, he had solved the larger equation of silence, exposing the variables of bias and power for what they were. And yet, even as the students cheered, even as Caldwell's face burned with humiliation, Marcus felt the weight of something deeper pressing on him. This wasn't just about the math problem. It wasn't just about Caldwell. It was about every room he had ever walked into where whispers had trailed behind him. It was about every opportunity taken, every scholarship denied, every quiet reminder that brilliance wasn't enough when it wore the wrong face. Now the world knew the truth. But what would he do with it? As the students gathered around him, voices chanting his name, Rachel stepped forward, her eyes shining. Marcus, you could change this place. You could be the one to finally make it different. Stay. Teach. They can't deny you now. Her words hit him like a tidal wave. Stay. Teach. The choice lay before him, clearer than ever. For the first time he had leverage, recognition, proof. He could stay. Fight from within. Carve a place where others like him would never again be silenced. But deep down, another voice whispered. The voice of every wound, every scar. The voice that reminded him institutions didn't change easily. That sometimes they buried people even after they were vindicated. The cheering grew louder, students pressing closer, phones capturing every second. Caldwell sat broken at the table, the board scattered and shaken. And Marcus stood at the center, his heart pounding, the choice before him heavier than any equation he had ever solved. His eyes scanned the crowd as the voices chanted, but inside he asked himself the hardest question of all. Would he stay and teach, or walk away forever? The chants still echoed in the halls when Marcus stepped outside into the rain. The storm had not let up, but the students hadn't either. Their umbrellas bobbed in unison, their voices rising against the gray sky. Let Marcus teach. Let Marcus teach. They surged toward him as he appeared, clapping, shouting his name, thrusting phones in the air to capture the moment. Some reached for his hand, some pressed signs higher, some simply stood in awe of the man who had dared to do what no one else had done. Confront the system, and win. But Marcus didn't raise his arms. He didn't smile for the cameras. He simply walked calm and steady, his coat damp from the rain, his gaze distant. Rachel pushed through the crowd, her hair soaked, her voice hoarse from hours on the megaphone. Marcus, she shouted, grabbing his arm. They listened. The board backed down. You could stay. You could teach here. This is your moment. He looked at her, his expression soft but weary. Moments don't change institutions, Rachel. They adapt. They wait. They bury. Her throat tightened. Then fight from the inside. Don't leave us. Don't leave me. Marcus studied her face, the fire in her eyes, the conviction in her voice. She reminded him of himself at her age. Before the rejections, before the doors slammed shut, before the whispers of not enough carved scars into his confidence, she carried the weight of a generation that still believed change could be wrestled from within. And he admired her for it. But he knew his truth. The board had cleared him only because the evidence had left them no choice. They had not celebrated him. They had not embraced him. They had tolerated him, because exposure was worse than justice. Staying would mean living under their scrutiny, their bureaucracy, their quiet sabotage. He would win small battles but lose himself in a war that never ended. He exhaled slowly, the rain cooling his skin. My fight isn't here anymore. Rachel's face fell. Around them, students cheered louder, as though their noise alone could bind him to the campus. But Marcus stepped back, his hands raised gently, signaling for calm. The crowd hushed, hundreds of voices shrinking into silence. Marcus's voice carried through the rain, low but strong. This was never about a single problem on a board. It was about the problems beyond it, the ones we pretend not to see, the ones hidden behind rules and masks. Today, you saw it with your own eyes, not because of me, but because you refused to stay silent. The students shifted, their faces lit not just by admiration but by realization. You asked why I'm not the professor, Marcus continued. The truth is, I could be. I've been ready my whole life. But the real question isn't why I'm not teaching here. The question is, why did it take humiliation to reveal the truth? Why did it take your voices to make them listen? His words landed heavy. Some students nodded. Others looked at the ground, guilt flickering in their expressions. Rachel stepped closer. So what happens now? Marcus looked out over the sea of umbrellas. The faces turned toward him, the phones capturing every syllable. Now, he said, this story doesn't belong to me. It belongs to you. Take it with you. Carry it into your classrooms, your jobs, your lives. Refuse to be silent the way I refused that day. If you want to honor what happened here, don't ask me to stay. Ask yourselves what you'll do when it's your turn to stand. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not cheers this time, but reflection. They felt the weight of what he was leaving them. Marcus turned, walking toward the gates of the university. His steps were steady, his shoulders squared. He didn't look back. Rachel watched him go, her chest tight with both pride and grief. Around her, students stood frozen, realizing they weren't just witnesses anymore. They were inheritors of a responsibility Marcus had handed to them. By nightfall, the videos had spread far beyond the campus. News outlets picked up the story. History teacher outshines math professor in viral showdown. Students rally behind guest lecturer after racist clash. The lesson beyond the equation. Marcus Hill and the fight for academic justice. National debates erupted. Talk shows dissected it. Commentators argued whether Marcus was a hero or a provocateur. But among students across the country, especially those who looked like him, the message was clear: brilliance was not theirs to give or deny. It had always been there. Emails flooded Marcus's inbox. Invitations to speak at universities, to join think tanks, to write a book. High school students wrote to him, I want to study math again, because of you. Parents sent notes. My daughter watched your video and said he looks like me. Maybe I can do it too. Marcus read them quietly, his heart heavy but full. He had not stayed, but he had not left empty. He had walked away, not in defeat, but in power. The campus moved on, as institutions always did. Caldwell remained, diminished but not removed. His authority cracked but not gone. The board released statements about valuing diversity of thought, their polished words ringing hollow against the truth students had seen for themselves. But Marcus's name lived beyond their halls now. His chalk strokes had outlasted their erasures. Months later, in classrooms across the country, students whispered his name before exams, not as gossip, but as inspiration. Teachers printed his quote. Sometimes the hardest problems are only impossible because we've been taught to see them in one way, and taped it to bulletin boards. He had left the campus as he had entered it, dignified, overlooked, but unbroken. And in the silence he left behind, a louder question emerged, not just for the university, not just for Caldwell, but for everyone watching. If one man with chalk can expose an empire of prejudice, what could happen if we all refuse to be silent? Stories like this aren't rare. They happen every day, hidden in silence. If you believe voices like Marcus's deserve to be heard, type yes in the comments. And if this story broke your heart, subscribe, not for me, but so more people see the truth that institutions try to bury.